So thanks to everyone who's here. It's very exciting for us to have you here in this second webinar in our series around social data in action. And today we're super excited that Marina Micheli has joined us from Varese, I think you've said, Marina, in Italy, and where it's it's probably just gone 8 a.m. in the morning. And Marina is going to talk to us about social data governance models in Europe. So I might just do the acknowledgement and then introduce Marina, Paul. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting a webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. I'm going to quickly just give some housekeeping here. So after, as Marina is speaking, you might come up with lots of questions, and we do encourage you to come up with questions. If you post these questions into the chat, then once Marina has finished her talk, Anthony will be fielding the questions, and he may hand it to you to ask the question if we can figure out who you are. And also, obviously, you can use the raise hand symbol at that point in Q&A as well. And we are recording this session, and if you don't want to be recorded, or if you have any questions about the recording, then contact Paul Levy at swinburne.edu.au. Okay, so I now want to take the opportunity to introduce Marina. Marina, as I've said, is joining us from Italy. Marina is a scientific project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. Her current work explores data governance for the public interest, examining in particular the perspectives of social actors and the emerging governance models. She is interested in the social value of data, digital inequalities, and data power. And her background is at the intersection of media studies and sociology. Prior to joining the Commission, she was a senior researcher and teaching associate at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University Milano Bicocca, perhaps, Italy. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to you, Marina. It's super great that you're here. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Jane. I will very quickly share the slides. Okay, I guess it's fine. So thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks a lot for having me here. Really, it's an honor for me to have the opportunity to present and discuss the results of this exploratory research project called DG Transcope. That run at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission from 2018 to 2020. First of all, a parenthesis about what is the Joint Research Center, the JRC. It is the science and policy interface of the European Commission, which is in charge of providing independent scientific evidence and support to European policymaking. So in the context of this project, this exploratory research project, we, among other things, we investigated the emerging approaches for personal data sharing, control, and use that are put forward by different social actors beyond big tech corporations. So we were doing so, we identified 4 alternative data governance models. I say alternative because they differ from the, let's say, take it or leave it approach for handling personal data that is typical of big tech platforms. and they differ in the sense that they grant more decision-making power to other actors beyond the platforms themselves, and they foster the production of different kinds of value. So the work was moved by two main goals, as you see. First, to develop an heuristic tool to examine and better understand current data practices, and to do so through a social science perspective that I will explain in a bit. And so overall, of course, the aim was to contribute in forming European data policy for fostering a fair data economy. So in the slide, you see some of the output of the project. There are those that I will mainly present today during the talk. Okay, I don't know. Okay, well, the work starts from the premises that there is a wide variety of imbalances when it comes to not only accessing data, but also in the ability and possibility to derive meaningful insights from data, the so-called big data divide. So it is widely recognized that from extracting value from big data has become a significant source of power for large players and internet platforms. So we moved from celebrating the emancipatory opportunity of social media in 2005 to now addressing critically the power of big tech platforms. But in particular, what we see here and what the examine is how to go beyond the hegemonic model of data governance that is embodied by big tech platforms. So the fact that the rules for governing data and controlling data are basically completely set by the platforms. So it's not only a matter of how platforms access data, but also how they control their governance. And in particular, it has been said that data subjects have lost control of their personal data. So for instance, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, claimed among others. But this issue is not only a matter of individual rights or socio-technical development of the World Wide Web. It's also, of course, a political and economic issue. So for instance, as this is shown by the quote from Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2018 from a talk at the World Economic Forum. Well, I will not go in detail about the geopolitical context, but of course, this work stems from the premises that we see now, some sort of delineation of three different macro approaches to the digital transformation to data, and that Europe is trying to take a different strategy to the digital transformation, both from the data commercialization model that distinguishes platform capitalism, but also from government control of citizen personal data that somehow characterize China nowadays. Two main things could be said about the European way to the digital transformation. One is that the digital transformation is expected to be in line with so-called European Union fundamental values of human dignity, human rights, freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law. And on the other hand, that Europe, let's say, does not want to be a digital colony of US internet giants. So it's working to protect its digital sovereignty by enhancing data flows across member states, across sectors, and across actors in Europe. Besides, of course, also regulating the market power of big tech corporations. But in the terms of data, there is a sort of shift from an open data paradigm to a shared data paradigm, which is based on reusing data to create more economic and societal benefits. So most of this is seen, for example, in the current European strategy for data, which is a set of action and new regulation that are being proposed basically this year. It is in this context, in this economic, political, and regulatory setting that we place our work. So we ask, to what extent such data asymmetries are tackled by the practices of the social actors for the governance of data. So we moved our attention to, as I said, the social practices, and also to such emerging concepts and terms sometimes buzzwords that at the time of the study circulated for defining various approaches to data governance. So to address this question, we propose a social science informed definition of data governance. With this definition, we want to emphasize the power relation between the actors that are involved in the way that data is handled, the kind of value that is produced through data and the reuse of data and how it is distributed, and also doing so accounting for the socio-technical mechanism that sustain these approaches. See, such mechanisms are both technological infrastructure, but they are also principle and system of thoughts that underpin and sustain these emerging models for data governance. So basically, we understand data governance not as data management at the micro level, neither as strictly only as data regulation at the macro level. We see data governance as the result of a process that develops from the practices of various actors and stakeholders, from the interaction, cooperation, negotiation between these stakeholders for controlling data, and then the models that consolidate from it. So basically, data governance is what is concerned who can make decision about data and who can influence the way that data is accessed and benefit from. Of course, the models that we analyzed emerge from the economic, political, and regulatory setting that I have briefly described before. But the idea of this work is also that from the social practices that could be influenced to future regulation and future development of the digital economy. So that's the definition of data governance that I just briefly sketched is drawn from science technology studies and critical data study, in particular from two concepts which allow to investigate the power dimension within socio-technical complex arrangement. So there is this idea of data infrastructure, so the data governance models are socio-technical systems in which a plurality of actors with multiple agendas and interacting with an array of tools, mechanisms, values, and systems. And also the idea of data politics. So the assumption that new power relations are generated in the process for accessing, controlling, and using data. And that is especially worthy, of course, to look at the perspective also of data subjects that are governed often by platform and institutions, but that they can also have an important role in intervening in data regimes. So in 2018 and at the beginning of 2019, we reviewed scientific and great literature looking for these emerging models. And so we basically looked at imagined or even implemented alternative practices for the governance of data. The models that we came up with that you can see in this slide that is taken from our publication on this are such models basically are ideal types. On purpose, they are abstract conceptualizations, so they want to emphasize certain traits in order to synthesize phenomena that, of course, in reality differ for the degree of affiliation to those traits. As reality is always measured than abstract concept, but such concepts and models, we think they can provide a basis to understand how such emerging data governance models are addressing the power asymmetry between big data platforms and data subjects. These models are not the exhaustive and final pictures of all possible models out there, but let's see together a bit more of these models. So now I will give an overview of these four models, then I will move to the conclusion and the main takeaway from the study. So data sharing tools are understood as horizontal joint initiatives among two or more data holders, organizations that could be both private and public entities, when established partnership for sharing, aggregating, and analyzing together each other's data. well, sorry. They set up specific infrastructure such as APIs or platforms, and they are built on legal contractual framework in which partners jointly define the modalities for data sharing. So basically how data can be handled and for which purposes. But the goal of such model is mainly to produce data-driven innovation, new services, and economic benefits among all the parties involved. Data sharing pools are the most widespread model among those that we described. Still, of course, it's important to highlight the main challenges and limitations of this model. First of all, of course, there are several obstacles that are identified in the literature to enter and establish data sharing pools, such as the fear of breaching commercial confidentiality or competition rules, so the GDPR, fear of security and cyber risk, and the technical resources that are needed to prepare the data set. Then once data sharing pools are established, their horizontality that I said before is easily challenged by the entrance in the pool of one data holder that possesses very more valuable data set. So such data holders can easily have greater power to set the terms on how data is accessed and used, and so recreate and confirm maybe a monopolistic position, for instance. So, and also another point of this model is that, as you see, data subjects are not included. They are mainly described as the recipient of the innovation and the outcomes that are generated from it. An example that I place here, even if examples I said before are always a bit messier than analytical construct, is is the Waze Connected Citizen Program, which is a collaboration between the platform Waze and local administration, municipal government. So as a part of the pool, basically municipal governments share the real-time construction or road closure data. And in exchange, Waze share the community collected data about traffic in real time. But one of the underlying principles of this model is that data is somehow a market commodity in the sense that more data means creation of more value. So the main goal here is filling knowledge gaps to create more profit. So to a certain extent, the assumptions are not completely different from that of the hegemonic model. Instead, data cooperatives, as you are probably already familiar with this concept, are understood as, of course, grassroots driven and decentralized organization in which members of certain communities voluntarily pool their data together, and such data can only be used for rules that members approved. So the cooperative is basically an entity that, on the one hand, facilitates the collaborative pooling and management of data, and on the other one, that is co-owned and democratically controlled by the members, through which there is a relationship of trust. So they are self-organized governance systems that allow democratic control. All members share equitable benefits that are produced with data. So data cooperatives are ideally generating benefits for the members of the community, for instance, empowering data subjects with the use of their health data. And at the same time, data cooperatives foster public interest or social change, such as health research or even workers' rights and such other issues. So basically, data cooperatives is the model that supports greater participation and transparency. But at the moment, of course, there are limitations. What are the limitations? Is that there are, of course, at the moment, niche initiative with limited uptake, especially because they mainly rely on data altruism and they do not have public incentives. And also, there are difficulties in their implementation and sustainability. Also difficult to scale up because of the low uptake. And also in terms of keeping democratic control and engagement of all members once they scale up. Well, the principle stems from the cooperative movement established in the UK in the 19th century, but also from more recent platform cooperativism. Basically, the principle of the cooperative movement is to promote fair condition of value production in a non-monopolistic and democratic setting. So what does it mean? That data cooperatives explicitly aim to provide an alternative to the extractivist model of platform capitalism. The third model we call public data trust, in which a public actor, such as a local administration, is the lead actor and establish a relationship of trust with citizens and manages their data or their data rights on their behalf. So the public actor assumes the role of a trustee. It guarantees that citizen data is handled ethically and securely, and most importantly, that data is reused for the public interest or the benefit of society. Also, access to public data trust is open to other actors, such as research institutions or SMEs, and so on. But it's the public body that has the responsibility of managing it. Well, the main, let's say, limitation of this model is that it is mostly somehow a conceptual model. There are very few complete implemented projects in full, in reality. And there are some, because there are lack of incentives and for public bodies to actually establish this. And also they are, of course, challenged by the bureaucratic structure, and somehow also in certain cases for the lack of resources, as they are funded by public taxes. There is, of course, the issue of data culture within public institutions, which is not always present. And a final point to raise is that many could see a danger of state surveillance and loss of privacy. So public data trust require public putting in place trust building governance mechanisms, such as citizen consultation and living labs, or independent data stewardship from non-profit organizations that can act as trusted intermediary, or other public oversight mechanisms. The underlying principle of public data trust is that all data with a public interest component, for instance, data collected as a byproduct of utilities consumption, or a byproduct of moving through local public transportation, all of this kind of data should be part of the public infrastructure. So the information that it affords should produce value for citizens and society. So also promoters of this approach are, for instance, Evgeny Morozov and Francesca Bria, and also the city of Barcelona with the project Decode. Well, the last model that we have called personal data sovereignty in the paper, it's a model in which data subjects individually regain control of their personal data through ad hoc digital services. So the main actor in this conceptual model are the individual. A key mechanism is the existence of an ecosystem of personal data spaces, which are, as I said, intermediary digital services that citizens can choose to store their personal data or use to collect and aggregate their personal data that is dispersed across platforms. And they can use also to control data sharing with third parties and for other purposes. So data sharing pool empower individual citizens because they improve the ability to make choices about their data and leverage the GDPR data portability rights. And they foster at the same time some economic growth in the sense that new commercial digital services are launched by SMEs and other entities. The main limitation of these models is that somehow, since personal data spaces are again business entities, of course, they might have interest in creating a more favorable position in the market and nudging users to be attached to their platforms. So there might still be a network effect if safeguard measures are not put in place. And also, for now, the majority of citizens because this system already exists, they're also called PIMS, Personal Information Management Systems. The majority of citizens do not have skills or time to maybe take advantage and really dig into this ecosystem of personal data spaces. Well, the underlying principle here is that of technological sovereignty intended as reducing, limiting the influence both of big tech platforms and states or governments in the control of technology, but this is applied specifically at the level of the individual users. So it's mainly understood in this model as individual empowerment. So from our analysis, you see we have, that I briefly summarize, identified 4 emerging models that in different ways foster more democratic forms of data governance that are different from the take it or leave it, as I said, approach of big tech platforms. Well, we think that thanks to the social science informed definition of data governance that is developed in the paper, the typology brings to the surface the key differences that are among the models beyond maybe apparent similarity. So of course, 3 out of these models involve data subjects, all besides data sharing pools that you see in orange. And of course, involving data subject is important step for a more democratic regime. But we can see from the description that involving data subject might have very different implications because all the models have a trusted data intermediary that give more power to data subject, but all have very different dynamics because this intermediary, this data intermediary could be a data cooperative that is a democratic entity that allow control and produce benefits for the members of a community, or it can be a public body that is entrusted by citizens, that has to be entrusted by citizens to use their data ethically and for the public interest. Or finally, such data intermediary, in the last example, could be a commercial service that is chosen from an ecosystem of new services that compete in the market. So basically here we point at the same notion or buzzword that we see at the time when we began the study is indeed used to refer to data practices that are very different at the core. So it's very different in terms of power relations that are actually supported. And moving to the conclusion, with our work, we pointed out that various social actors are currently thinking and developing new approaches that are alternative to the hegemonic data governance model that we have been used to in the last year. But most of these models are in their early stages. They are niche initiatives, they are pilot projects, and they have challenges and limitations. Still, the models provide conceptual ideas, but not much information probably about the practical implementation that has to be examined. One conclusion, of course, is that there is no one-size-fits-all data governance model to be recommended or promoted for an equitable data landscape, but instead hybrid models. So a combination of all these models should be proposed. And eventually we should discuss how to make centralized models, such as the public data trust idea, with decentralized models, such as the data cooperative approach. Of course, the results show that civil society and public bodies could be key actors for promoting models that are truly alternative in terms of power relation and value production. So their role in data governance should be supported to avoid that market forces determine who have a say over data and how data is used. And finally, a social science perspective of data governance is useful to unveil data power relation and differences among alternative data governance models, and in particular to promote in the future more inclusive data governance that accounts and balances the interests of all stakeholders, including those that at the moment have less negotiation power over data. So we hope that the typology, presented in the paper can work as an heuristic device for scholars and policymakers that want to design empirical research or develop theoretical commentaries that address issues of data power for fostering the development of more desirable future of our data economy. And well, finally, a disclaimer, of course, in my talk, I'm not representing the Commission, the European Commission as a whole, but I report the work and the thinking that were developed across the DG Transco project by a team of researchers and policy officers. So, well, if you're interested, I suggest maybe to have a look at the collaborative final report of the project and the multi-author paper that was published to have a better understanding of our work. That would be all. Thank you. I will interrupt.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marina. We have plenty of time here and plenty of amazing people working in and across data projects, data governance, data sharing. And so I'm hoping to be able to open this up to discussion. I'll kick off with a question from Jane. Jane, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, why not? Thanks, Marina. That was really great and really clear and really structured and easy to understand. I guess I'm interested in whether the EU has envisages an active role in this from your perspective in encouraging more kind of citizen input, and is likely or showing some interest in supportive mechanisms around some of these models that are particularly more citizen empowerment or included oriented. Do you see anything like that happening?
Yes, of course. When one action of the European data strategy that I showed before is the Data Governance Act, which was, the proposal of the Data Governance Act was released, I think, in December or late November last year. And in that proposal, there are many ideas that overlap with this work. And it's interesting because also when we started the project, we were not really at the very beginning familiar with the Data Governance Act regulation, but across the months that we were working on it, there was more exchanges also with the DG Connect that was developing with this regulation. And finally, when we saw the final proposal of the regulation, we saw that data cooperatives and teams or personal information management system or personal data spaces are indeed present into the regulation. And because the intention of such act is to support different actors in enabling access to data, and especially to support the creation of data intermediaries that can help people to share their data for the public interest. It's really one of the goals of that act, as you may already know. But it's important because in that act, it emerged this idea of creating a data economy that is both that also foster that is mixed in the sense that it also fosters social value, and it also generates space for not only SMEs but also for cooperatives, public interest organizations, or NGOs. Of course, and it's also interesting because the first take. One of the first paragraphs of this proposal really mentioned that this is done to limit the power of big tech platforms in terms of their monopolistic power on data. And I think it's interesting because it is in parallel with other measures such as the Digital Service Act or the Digital Market Act that really work on the competition issue, more traditional economic issues. Instead, in this one, basically the same data asymmetry is tackled from the perspective of what kind of other measure can be implemented to reduce data for the public interest. Of course, it's still a proposal, and there are still questions regarding how it will work. especially because the big question is in terms of the sustainability of data cooperatives or personal data spaces, especially when they are not economic actors. I mean, if they are economic actors, there is the question of how to have safeguards to guarantee that they do not, at the end, reach a monopolistic position or a too big a position. And if they are social actors such as cooperatives, well, then it's the question of how to help these to grow and to, in terms of organization and in terms of sustainability. So there are still many questions on this regard, but indeed, in the Data Governance Act, data cooperatives and personal data space are really seen as the enabler of our sharing of data, and explicitly so as not necessarily economic actors, or at least not, I mean, pursuing that kind of objectives in the end. Also, well, maybe there is another question I was seeing popping up on
Thanks.
this.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah, there's a question from Anne. Anne, did you want to ask the question yourself or frame it in your own?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I was kind of, this is really very interesting and I think very important high level kind of overarching sorts of arrangements, but I was sort of wondering what your work is. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Michelle, is it? Marina, sorry, Micheli, that's right. Marina, my apologies. What's your work beginning to tell you about how to engage both institutions and organisations? And I'm particularly interested in social or community organisations who are not heavily endowed with resources, if I can put it mildly, in these matters, but also recognise that it's really important to engage. And it just seems so big, so huge, so out there. So I'm sort of wondering, are you starting to get some sense of what's required to engage those more on the ground voices in this kind of conversation?
Well, thanks, of course, thanks for the important points for sure. Well, basically with this work was, as I said at the beginning, this was an exploratory research project. So the idea was to include new themes that at the Joint Research Center at the time when we started were not even yet into the mainstream research agenda. So just to, that's probably why we took a such very high level.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. We wanted to sort of make straight what is the field and what can be done. So indeed, this is a preliminary work for more empirical research that indeed has to engage, as I said, with community and social services or other kind of actors. So the idea was to continue the work with empirical research, but indeed the road that we take so far was to engage with public bodies and local administration first. So this is what you are asking is indeed an area that we are thinking of including more in our research, but is not, I have to say, yet maybe so present in terms of data governance. There is other kind of research, yes.
Just one thing, I don't want to monopolize any more time, but one of the things I've learned is I was previously an academic, I work in the practice space and I go backwards and forwards. I work in the spaces in between in many ways. So I'm a bit, no, I'm not muddled, but it's just more complex. And what I'm learning is that the sooner you get people on the ground engaged, not just the kind of working through it, but the actual way of framing it, it can actually also really inform your theoretical and heuristic devices. So the way you think about it. So my encouragement would be to get that into the thinking, like right at the beginning, in a way. Yeah, I know it's easier said than done.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks, Anne. I've got a follow-up question. Maybe it's related, maybe it's just an additional question, but I'm interested in how social value gets defined in these models, in and around these models. You know, whether it's through the proposed Data Governance Act, for example, or through the models themselves, or through the actors and organisations that are kind of championing the different models. And how did that feature in your work? Was that something that has been defined, that is defined, that is being defined, or, you know, maybe there are mechanisms for thinking about what social value is, and maybe even economic value, not like there's who gets to extract additional economic value out of reuse of data, for example, is clearly a different question to the social value that might be extracted out of reuse of data.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, since we were mostly analyzing well, grey literature documents and scientific paper of let's say conceptual or projects that were not even sometimes implemented in practice. So we were looking mainly at discourses, or what kind of well, normative system were at the ground of these different ideas of controlling and sharing data. So we didn't have a system to assess really the value that was produced by such models, because we didn't look at their implementation. So what we mainly looked, what all kind of orientation and goals towards value production that were different to what extent from the extractivist model, as you are familiar with, big tech platform. So we really wanted to see in general what kind of understanding of and what kind of goals were at the core of this model. It was mainly looking at discourse. In fact, there is also this other question, how to measure the social value produced by these implementation. No? But I think it's also interesting to think in the abstract term, because you still point to the fact that the governance of data is not necessarily aimed to increase economic profit for certain platforms. I mean, this is also what we wanted to see, what there is besides extractivism with data, because of course it's a simple question, but it's what we ask, is we ask what there is around beyond that. Because if you want to measure social value, sometimes you still, I think, I mean, you might risk to be in the game of measuring economic value again. I don't know what to say, what to explain it well, no? But if you want to see the alternatives, also the sometimes utopias even, the idea was to not stick to the measurement of the value produced, but look more at normative understanding of value indeed. That's more. But I would be happy to know more about your take also on these issues, because I know you have done a lot of work on these issues, so feel free to chip in with your experience.
Yeah, and I think it comes up, like this question comes up sometimes when you're speaking with or speaking across different kinds of organizations with different sorts of missions, and you know, when there's a bank involved, for example, that might have some sort of social good agenda that they want to or community-based agenda. Sometimes it appears to be couched in those terms of social value, but essentially still about extracting additional resources for their commercial you know, enterprise, and it, of course it becomes even more complex and muddy when it's about social enterprise, where there is a kind of profit as well as social aspect to you know, a data project or some some aspect of data reuse or data use. So I don't have any solutions, that's for sure, but it's clearly complicated.
No, clearly, okay, yeah, I understand now better your question. Of course, we cannot take the aim to produce social value at face, as a reality. It's just an intention, but that's again probably the limitation of the paper of being a conceptual tool. So the idea is to look at what they are claiming to address. But at the same time, we introduce this element of power relation also to have another tool to actually check what this model are supporting. And in terms of going beyond, let's say, the facade of doing social good, that sometimes it's actually more complex. In the other study that we conducted later on local administration access to private sector data for the public interest, for instance, which is related to this one, and it was a more empirical study, we pointed to the fact that data, for instance, data donorship or data altruism, I mean, you can give it different names, but from big tech corporation to local administration. So giving data up for good, no profit, without no monetary exchange, was indeed not the best solution and the best models in terms of power relation between local administration and cities. So because for many reasons, but one of the reasons, for instance, is that only certain local administration are more likely to be beneficiaries of data altruism initiatives, at least in Europe. Because of course, the most famous smart cities or the bigger capital are more likely to be contacted by tech to give data for free. And this reinforced position. This is just an example to how looking at the power issue indeed is helpful to go beyond this claim of doing good with data, which is more complex for sure. So yes.
Are there any other questions? I have more myself, but
Amir's got one.
So Marina, I have a question for you related to the data equity and heterogeneous data co-ops. So data cooperatives, in the way that you explained, a lot of them are for kind of like individual citizens that they contribute data to a bigger pool. It's not always work like that. Sometimes data cooperative forms as a result of different organizations coming together and each one contribute data into that pool. Usually when that happens, then the data co-op is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. We have different value data added to the pool, and also that often they are from different, representing different aspects of the cooperatives. Now, if those data cooperatives derive certain decision-making in the community, then the whole the role of the players of contributing data into that cooperative make a big difference on what the data insights come out of the cooperatives. Now, in your experience in Europe, do you have experience of problems like this, that the data cooperative drives certain public policies or certain community engagements, and the data sets that been put into that cooperative drives the conversation, but there's always conflicts and there is a kind of battle of ideas that what data actually needs to go into the cooperative and how they have to be kind of connected in a way that project different perspective. This is really goes back to that principle of the data-driven policy making or policy-driven data making in the cooperatives. It's very, very easy to game the system. So just, I want to hear your experience with this in Europe and say, how does it go with this challenge?
Okay, well, one example on data cooperatives. I mean, first of all, I would like to say that, as I said at the beginning, in reality, these models are different from what I've described because they do these ideal types. So in reality, the affiliation of these traits can be partial. So in reality, indeed, it's more likely to find hybrid models, as you mentioned in your example from your knowledge, probably, in the sense that there are data cooperatives that are more towards individual empowerment, so they are maybe similar more to the 4 model, and data cooperatives that are more truly embedded in communities and and developed from initiatives of civic group. So there are different, let's say that some cooperatives can be fake cooperatives in the sense that indeed they are other digital services that are used without much engagement and knowledge in terms of what a data subject can do and how can democratically participate. So that is actually the idea of this model, but to see the degree to which in reality initiatives and data practices do actually conform to the model that they say that they are going towards. For instance, of course, I know that in terms of data cooperatives, there is a nice recent article from Trevor Scholz, I think, on data co-op whitewashing, and also with another colleague, ex-colleague of mine, Igor Calzada. So it's an interesting article because they point exactly, I think, to what you mentioned is so the fact that if there is not the actual involvement of bottom-up community into the establishment of the data cooperatives organization, it's not really a data cooperative, so it's white cooperative washing in the sense. And also what I wanted to say in terms of examples that comes to my mind, well, one example could be that of the project Decode, that is very much, maybe you are also familiar in Australia. I'm not sure how you follow European project. Decode is a project, decentralized system, own data ecosystem, but it was a project that ran in several cities in Europe, so in Barcelona and Amsterdam, and was put forward by Francesca Bria. And it's interesting because it works with the local administration, as I said, but it also based on the establishment of civic group at the city level that use data sharing initiatives to make their voice heard on different regions. So I think it is a combination between public data trust and data cooperatives, which is sustained by more clear societal goal, also thanks to involvement of the municipality in this case. So this is just to say that in reality, it is much more complex than the models indeed.
Thanks. And thank you. Have a question from Kimberly as well. Did you want to jump in, Kimberly?
In some ways, you've just addressed the sorts of questions that I was raising in the chat, which is that, you know, like I've read the Big Data and Society paper. It's terrific work. Thank you for that. But one of the interesting things is you're sort of painting a picture of some models, but without really, maybe this is the lawyer in me, without kind of stating any kind of minimum conditions for things to actually count as something like a public data trust or a data cooperative. You started to hint at some of that in that answer just then, you know, that there are things that make something more truly cooperative. Is there a next stage to this work that actually starts to think about what are the kind of minimum conditions for something to actually count as that? Maybe there are, maybe there aren't, maybe that's just something that we need to keep working on. And maybe the real answer is nothing will conform to a perfect model anyway, and we're going to end up with a bunch of hybrids. The other question that I was going to ask that again gets at some of the stuff you started to talk about then is what's the link between all these moves towards data sharing and the existence of intermediaries? Because what we're observing with some of the data sharing legislation in Australia is, you know, there's this idea that government will share with companies or with researchers, but a lot of those relationships are being set up as kind of contractual relationships rather than the creation of any kind of intermediary that could manage that process. And I'm wondering, is it similar in Europe, or is data sharing being talked of in conjunction with some of these ideas of creating trusted intermediaries?
Well, Luca, thank you, Kimberly. It's a great question. Indeed, probably.
It's nice to see you, by the way.
Yes. Okay, nice to see you indeed. I mean, it's a great question, and it did make a great project. The thing is that the project was, well, we wanted to start from the practices, you know. I know that it's maybe, we wanted to really see and challenge what is out there. So we wanted to look at how the practices can actually fulfill the model that they claim to propose. So we want to compare the social practices that are currently being developed in Europe to thinking and implement a different way for accessing data. What do they say about the power relation? So we didn't want to be normative and say how they should be act, but we wanted to say what can we learn from what is going on. Of course, that is, as you said, completely, that is the first step from such work. And what we did was these other studies on local administration, for instance, no? That we then went to see what it meant exactly to access privately held data by citizens. Just a little piece of, just an angle to look at public data, a part of a public data trust, and what many challenges and power inequality already emerged from that one. So yes, the idea and that is to, well, it is not to put normative, but normative, I don't know, parameters to, but well, I have to say that there is a new project that is started that wants to more precisely identify what are the enablers and what are the obstacles for creating more inclusive data sharing. So in that sense, there is something planned, but it is not something that we have already done, to be honest. But I think, well, I think your point is very important indeed. So yes, and I see you also wrote something about side work labs, but you didn't mention in your question. So, but
no, thank you. That's okay. That's helpful. That sort of that helps me understand where you're coming from on that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're at the hour, everyone. So I'd like to wrap up, and sorry if there were more questions. I had more questions, but maybe we can continue the conversations offline. And it's really good to connect up over this kind of these kinds of issues and topics. I'd just like to quickly shout out a reminder for the third in our Social Data in Action webinar series, which will be with Sarah Williams next Tuesday at 9:30. So get on to the registration for that one. And I'd really like to thank Marina for your time and insights. The work is really important to the work that we're doing in the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, but also in the Social Innovation Research Institute at Swinburne. So it's really good to have your input, and to everyone who came along, and to the questions that I think were really pointed and shows that we're all working in this space, in this emerging space. So hopefully we can keep these conversations going. Thank you, everyone.
So much, Marina. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great meeting you, and thanks for the great question and debate. Thanks a lot.
Cool.
Have a nice evening.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, really. Thanks.